All right, good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Almond Conference. Hopefully we'll get a few more people in here. I think next year we'll ask for a bigger room. I think that we need a little bit more space here. Feel free to spread out like you already have. That's great. If you want to come close, that's good as well. What we thought we'd do today is to kind of take you through the process for goods return. What happens when you have a load that's rejected somewhere other than outside of the United States? So we're going to divide here. My name is Tim Birmingham. I'm Director of Quality Assurance and Industry Services for the Almond Board of California. I've been working for the Almond Board for 17 years. My job really is focused on working with the programs that are applied here in California, helping the growers and the processors to produce a safe quality product. One of the programs that we manage is the pre-export check program. My colleague here, Abby Kulkarni, has been with the Almond Board since 2021. He is a principal working with technical and regulatory affairs issues. So when there is a challenge with product outside of the U.S., probably one of the first people that you would call would be Abby to help you kind of navigate some of those challenges. We work very closely together on goods return, so getting that product back to the U.S., getting it through the FDA process, as well as Abby will talk about what are some of the other options for product when it is rejected overseas. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's just the two of us today, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the rejections overseas first. Abby will walk us through that, and then I'll talk about the process for actually getting the product back here through the goods return process with FDA. So I'm going to turn it over to Abby. Hope you enjoy the session.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Tim, for the introduction. So as Tim mentioned, I'm part of the Global Technical and Regulatory Affairs team at the Almond Board. And so in that role, we monitor pretty much any and all issues that impact the exports of our product. And one of those is rejections. So let's get started. So I want to first take like a 60,000-foot view of see what is the scope of things we are talking about. So this is a map of the shipping routes. This is not just the almond. This is all global shipping routes for all different commodities. And I've tried to indicate on the upper left corner where you would be Oakland, the port of Oakland, which is the main port for California almond industry. And as you can see, there's shipping lanes going in all different directions. Given that almonds are exported to almost 100 countries, directly or indirectly, you can bet that California almond shipments are somewhere on those routes. But what does that mean in terms of numbers? So looking at the shipping stats for last crop year, 2023-24, we exported 1.96 for almost 2 billion pounds of California almonds around the world. To put it in a different way, that's about 45,000 20-ton containers. So I've just done a few there. So you can see the amount of almond volume we ship throughout the world. So given that, of course, it's normal that there will be some rejections along the way, given how much we ship. And so today we are going to discuss of when that happens, what do we do? Because even though there might be very few rejections for the industry as a whole, if you're the handler whose consignment is rejected, for you that's a significant event because now you have to spend time, money in dealing with it and figuring out what to do. So that's what we are going to discuss today. So let's start with what is a rejection. So for purpose of this discussion, we are primarily going to look at through the lens of EU and Japan and aflatoxin rejections. Why is that so? Because when you look at the total number of rejections for the industry as a whole, some 99% of the rejections are because of aflatoxin exceedances in EU and Japan, where the limits is 10 parts per billion for aflatoxin total and 8 parts per billion for B1. So anything about that will be rejected. And so we are looking primarily through that lens. Of course, not once in a blue moon, we do see rejections for other reasons than aflatoxin. So we'll see a few hygiene or infestation cases. We might see a salmonella rejection once in a while. But vast majority of them are aflatoxin exceedances. So we'll primarily discuss in that parlance. And Tim is going to talk in the second part of the discussion on goods return. And even though we are primarily focusing on Japan and EU, The procedure he's going to talk will apply to any rejections from any country coming back to United States, because that's all treated the same regardless of where it's coming back from, and Tim is going to discuss on that. So added that note in bold at the bottom, notice is lack of PEC or pre-export check documents is not ground for rejection. How many of you are familiar with pre-export check program? Okay, I see quite a few hands. For those of you who are not familiar, so California Almonds has an agreement with the European Union that we do pre-export sampling and testing for aflatoxin here before shipping the product. In exchange, our products are inspected at a much lower rate, less than 1%, whereas all other commodities are inspected at a much, much higher rate, anywhere from 5 to 50%, some even 100%. We are the only US commodity that has this kind of privilege. And the important thing to note about the pre-export check program, it is voluntary. So you can still ship to Europe without pre-export check program. Occasionally, because this program has been so successful in the past 9.5 years since its inception, everybody just assumes that that's a requirement for shipping to EU. It's not. And even both sometimes in the industry as well as overseas in the different ports, people just think or assume that this is a condition of import, and they detain the shipment saying, oh, you do not have the PEC certification. So then we get a phone call, then we get involved and let them know, actually, this is not a requirement. Here's the EU regulation that stipulates clearly, and they're like, oops, sorry, and then the shipment is cleared. So if something like that ever happens, notify us immediately, because in the overall tiers of rejection, that's the easiest one to deal with, because it should not be a rejection to begin with. So here's a quick look at the rejections in the EU in the past few years. As you can see, it's kind of hard to look over there. Except that skyscraper in the 2018 when we had 32 rejections, when we had particularly bad winter leading to a lot of fungal diseases in the orchard for the subsequent harvest. Most of the other have been kind of stayed steady, like about 8, 12, 6, 9. This year to date, we are at 8, which is again within the average expectation, what we would expect for rejection. And so we just talked about the pre-export check programs. I won't go more into detail. But looking at the number of rejections as a proportion of the volume we ship to Europe, it's very low. Europe is our second biggest export market, just behind Asia Pacific now. It used to be number 1, but thanks to growth of export to India, Europe is now slightly behind that, so number 2, but still a substantial market. And we are exporting still about 12,000 20-ton containers equivalent volume. So out of the 12,000, if you imagine 8 are rejected, that's a very small percentage. And looking at Japan, the other market, Japan is a little bit different from EU because Japan inspects every single almond consignment, so there's 100% inspection. And currently, they do not allow for reprocessing if there is a rejection. With EU, there's options for doing something locally, and I'll get to that in a minute. Japan, there's no such thing. You have to bring it back. So we recently had meetings with the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, MHLW, which deals with the import control. And there was a good positive discussion. There is a chance that we might have a protocol similar to EU for Japan. What that means is from that 100%, we might end up going down to 5%. So which will be huge for our industry, because that will also impact the number of rejections. And of course, we will do the similar program to EU, where we will do more testing and inspection here before shipping it to Japan. But currently, as you can see, numbers, we are 29, whereas EU we had 8. And that's the level because Japan inspects every single shipment. So what are your options when you do have inspections? And this is kind of a quick schematic. I don't know if everybody can see. Yeah, okay. So what happens to the product depends on specific country, requirements, practicality of what the customer wants, what do you need to do, how soon, and above all, also the costs of all the different options. So as you can see, the different options, the easiest one is the one below, retest. And a lot of people are not aware that if we have a rejection in EU, we have a right to request a retest. most people get the rejection from their buyer and say, oops, okay, now let's figure out what to do with it. Ask for a retest first thing, because that might be the cheapest option. It has happened a few times this year. It already happened with 2 handlers where they asked for a retest. The retest came clean, shipment proceeded. And so that retest was like 300 euros or so. So that was the cheapest option to deal with rejection. If that doesn't happen and even the rejection, the retest comes about tolerance, then you can discuss with your customer, do we do reconditioning? Do we send it off, get it resorted, test it again? Or we just don't want to deal with all that hassle and bring it back, in which case then you do goods return to EU. And there's other option of diverting to alternate market. So if it might fail the EU limits, but it might pass India's or Korea's or some other country, so you can divert it to that country. There's another option, or not option, there's a stipulation, but that rarely happens, and there's destruction of consignment. I have not seen it because rarely do consignments end up in that bad a shape where the EU authorities say, okay, no, this needs to be destroyed. So, but that is on their books, but luckily it hasn't happened. So, oops, let me press. There you go. So I've already touched upon some of the top 2. Reprocessing in Europe, typically any facility that can provide resorting service can serve as a reconditioning facility, because that's essentially what you're doing. You're sending it, they're sorting your product, and you're removing the damaged insects, and then retesting it, and then getting it passed. So anything to do, there are some facilities in Spain and Netherlands that offer that service. And then the last point, the US goods returns. We have heard from the industry that when you do bring these goods back, the experience is not the same every time, even if it's the same port coming. So once it's a very smooth process, next time FDA makes you jump through different hoops and all of these different conditions. And that's an ongoing discussion that Tim is having with FDA in terms of how can we make this procedure streamlined and same every time, rather than different port, different people having different experiences. And so Tim is going to give more updates in terms of our latest discussions with the FDA in that plan. So let's run through a typical rejection scenario. So you, as a shipper, get your shipment PEC certified in California, do everything, leaves on Port of Oakland typically, or sometimes Long Beach, heads to Spain, your buyer notifies that everything is well, they arrive. A few weeks later it takes, Port of Valencia decides randomly to pull your shipment aside for testing, and then they find out you exceeded the aflatoxin and you're getting 24. Oh, oops. Next thing, you call us. So what happens next? Well, first, the EU will issue what is called a rapid alert. So EU keeps track of goods rejected in all the different ports in the European Union, and there is a central database. So they will issue a notification that on this day, this particular shipment coming from United States was rejected for these grounds on aflatoxin exceedance. And so it goes into their database. Typically, they will notify the central authority in Brussels. The ag attaches of the US Embassy in Brussels will get notified. And they will notify us as a central or a local authority saying, this rejection happened for one of your shipments. And so then we'll contact the shipper, get all the information of the date, the container number, if there was a PEC certification involved, what the PEC certificate number was, et cetera, et cetera. And so then we will run with all the previous options we just looked at with the shipper and saying, what do you want to do? And then typically that's when the shipper will then decide the option after talking with the buyer, or make their own decision in terms of bringing it back. The key thing is, as a shipper, you need to let us know whatever decision you made, because we need to close the loop with the European Union authorities. Because unless we tell the authorities that this shipment has been brought back or has been sent for retesting and has been cleared, they will keep the alert open. And what happens is, the implication is that you as a shipper stay on their radar then, because they look at the database and saying, this particular alert has not been closed out yet. We don't know what happened to this shipment because they haven't told us. And so you'll stay on their alert list. So that's not something you want. So always let us know once you have decided that, okay, I'm going to send this for retesting and it's been cleared now, or I'm bringing these goods back. In which case, then we will issue a letter for bringing the goods back. Here's just a quick look at what are the estimated costs of rejection. Mind you, this was made a couple of years ago, so they might have changed now a little bit, and this was just like an informal survey talking with a bunch of people in the industry in terms of what is the cost of reprocessing in the EU itself versus what is the cost of bringing back. Now, if you look at the totals at the bottom of both columns, not surprisingly, the cost of reprocessing in the EU is cheaper because you're not paying for the freight to come back the ship. Once you add that on top, if you're bringing it back, then your bill goes up. And again, this varies on how long this has been going on, how long it's sat in detention, and so on. So roughly for EU, we are looking at 3,000 to 5,000, and this again is on the lower side. Your experience may vary depending on your specific scenario. Whereas returning to consignment, 8,000 to 9,000 on the lower side, could be higher depending on shipping season, if there's more demand for containers, difficult to get a spot on the ship and so on, that bumps up the prices. So the tips for reprocessing, time is always of the essence. Once you get the rejection notification, you want to make a decision quickly. If you want to do a request a retest, or if you want to have the shipper send it, or your local buyer send it over to a retesting facility, or if you have decided you just want to bring it back upon talking and looking at all your options, do it quickly, because the longer it sets, you have two things. A, you're accruing detention and demurrage charges. B, your quality of the goods is going down, because who knows what kind of condition your container is sitting in the port. Could be hot, humid in the middle of summer. Of course, the faster you make the decision and get that container moving, the better. And so, as we mentioned, some of the activities that we have been doing, that because there is usually turnover at different EU ports, or also within different ministries in different EU member states, it is always essential that we keep in contact with the current staff to let them know of what the pre-export check program is, what we do as ABC in terms of all the hard work that the industry does in terms of sampling and testing here, so that they are aware of what we do and your shipments don't get held unnecessarily. And so most recently, we've had visits to Italy, Spain, and Netherlands in past year, talking with the ministries of health as well as their port officials, just kind of inspecting and exchanging views on what they have seen from almond shipments and what we are doing in terms of improving quality. We also had a visit from the Japanese ministry, as I mentioned earlier, where we're talking about hopefully to get that new protocol signed up for Japan, which will reduce the rate of inspection once the containers arrive in Japan. And then there's always ongoing webinars we do for the different port officials throughout the world, just kind of keeping them appraised of all the work that the industry puts in terms of making sure that when we ship the product, it is of the best possible quality. And with that, now I will pass on to Tim to see part 2 of what happens when the goods are back.
Okay, thanks, Abby. All right, so bringing the product back to the U.S. I know it seems like it's jumping through hoops, and I think the thing to keep in mind is that FDA considers all food coming into the U.S. under their purview, and even food of U.S. origin, it's considered to be an import, and so FDA is going to treat that product the same as any other import that's coming into the U.S. Now, granted, we've worked with FDA to try to get them to understand that U.S. almonds coming back in should not necessarily be treated exactly like other imports, but they do have an obligation to make sure that the food is safe, including those almonds that are being returned back to the U.S. So all imports, they are subject to Custom Borders Protection and Food and Drug Administration scrutiny. All imported foods, they have to be deemed pure, wholesome, safe to eat, and produced under sanitary conditions. So this is what FDA wants to determine. And then any product that's coming into the U.S. Prior notification has to be issued to either FDA or Custom Borders Protection. So today what I'm going to talk about on the goods return part, it's really three processes. The first part is to get that product back onto the U.S. soil. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that should be happening as that product is coming back. The second one, I think this is the one that people get hung up on the most, that causes the most problems, is actually preparing and submitting the reconditioning plan, making sure you get that plan very detailed and correct so that FDA can review it, they can approve it, and then you can carry out the plan. To me, carrying out the plan, that's the easiest part because you've already done all the work and FDA has agreed to the plan that you've submitted. So that step two really is the one that's the most important. It's the one that people get hung up on the most. FDA only gives you 2 chances to get it right. So if you do not get your reconditioning plan correct and they come back to you and they want it to be resubmitted, now you only have one more turn to get it right. So it's really important to have a lot of detail in there, and I'm going to walk through that with you all here today. And as Abby mentioned, so if you had a load that failed in Europe, in his example, 24 part per billion, you can rest assured that that load is going to be flagged for reconditioning, so you're going to have to do something to bring that product back into compliance. The U.S. limit for aflatoxin is 20 part per billion. The EU limit is 10 part per billion total and 8 part per billion B1. So if product fails in the EU at some level less than 20 part per billion, let's say 12 part per billion total, FDA may not require reconditioning on that product. They may say that it's fine. You can bring that product in. You don't have to recondition. But they could also come back and say, you know what, this product's been flagged for aflatoxin, even though it's below the U.S. limit at 12 part per billion. We want you to do something. That's really up to the individual inspector. I know it's frustrating because in some cases, as a handler, you may bring a load back that failed at 15 and FDA won't require you to do anything. In another case at 12, maybe they will. It's really up to FDA to make that determination, though. So the first thing on getting that product back, as Abby mentioned, it's really important to notify the ABC. It's important so that we can be aware of what's happening with closing out that rapid alert, as he mentioned, but also in issuing a goods return letter to the EU authorities to allow that product to be released. That's a very important part of the process. So as early as you can, notify ABC. You can contact Abby and get that ball rolling. The second thing is working to get it, to get the prior notification submitted. So working with your customs broker to really, someone who's understanding of the process of bringing product back to submit that notification. It has to be submitted no less than 8 hours before it arrives, and you can submit 2 different ways. You can go through the FDA prior notice system, their interface. It's called the PNSI. You can submit that no sooner than 15 days before anticipated arrival, or you can go through the Customs Border Protection Automated Broker interface, and that one is no sooner than 30 days prior to arrival. And then the tip here is that any person that's familiar with the process can submit these notifications on your behalf. You can do it as the handler. You can contract with your broker to do this for you, but someone needs to be familiar with that process to submit on your behalf. All right, and then the third part of getting that product back is prepare for a detention notification. So as I mentioned, if it comes back at less than 20, there's still the possibility that FDA will require you to recondition that product. And so I would be advising you to start to prepare for a notice from FDA that they're going to detain that product and require reconditioning. They may not, if it's between 10 and 20, they may release it, but there's a good possibility they'll still require you to prepare a reconditioning plan. So one of the things here too is oftentimes the documents that you're going to receive on the failure in the EU, it's going to be in a foreign language. So work during this time. You've got a little bit of time as that product's coming back to translate some of these documents into English. You can submit this to the TAC system, to FDA, so that they can see the information that you've seen as well. This will help to shorten the period of review that FDA will apply as they're reviewing any plan you submit. All right, so now we're going to get into really the second part of bringing the goods back. And this, as I mentioned, this to me is the most important part, and it's also the part that handlers get hung up on quite a bit. And it's because FDA requires a ton of information. And that's on preparing this detailed reconditioning plan. And I always laugh because the form that they're going to issue, you're going to have to prepare is this FDA Form 766, this reconditioning plan. And that little highlighted section right there, that's the section that they give you to actually write your reconditioning plan. It's just a little box, right? So you can probably write three sentences. That's not enough. So you're going to have to submit a lot of external information outside of this actual form. You're going to have to reference that in this form, but you're going to have to submit a very detailed plan. I'm going to walk through what that plan looks like. And then, the thing about this plan, you want to be working with your FDA compliance officer, and you can actually contact them before you even submit the plan. You'll notice on the detention form who your FDA officer is. You can reach out to them by telephone, by email. If you have any questions, we would encourage you to contact them as soon as possible to start to build that rapport so that when you do submit a plan, there is the possibility they may just reach out to you in an email and say, hey, we need more information here instead of rejecting your plan outright. I think that's a very important thing to do because, as I mentioned, you only get two chances to submit the plan. Details, details, details. All right. So what is a detailed reconditioning plan? There's really these 5 parts. There's the company information. So that's just who you are, the address, the contact information, the description of what you do, where your facilities are located. There's the information on the product itself. So the return goods background information. So this is the description of the product, the packaging description, when it was packed, when it was shipped, any testing that was done for aflatoxin. So if it was tested under the pre-export check program, that information can be included here in this section as well. The aflatoxin and almonds background information. This is information that we have in a guide that's shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. Just the first page of it. It's about a 4-page document that really walks through how to prepare the plan. But we've referenced some of the studies that support the efficacy of sorting for reconditioning. And that can be, just removing defects. It could be blanching. But we reference those studies, and we have some specific language that you can cut and paste and put into your plan. We have to constantly remind the FDA officers on what reconditioning is, and then we always reference back to the research that we've conducted to show the efficacy. There's always a training element with FDA as they bring in new inspectors. And that's a little bit of the frustration that I know that you all feel is that, sometimes you're working with an inspector that gets it right away and sometimes you're not. That's where we as the ABC are trying to always keep them updated. All right, so the other thing is the reconditioning method. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail here on the next slide on that. And then the other part is, what are you going to do after you recondition? So how are you going to test that product to verify that it is indeed within the U.S. limits, so the less than 20 part per billion? So that's an important part that you have to build into your reconditioning plan. And you have to utilize a lab that's very familiar with this process, because the lab has a lot of work to do to put together an analytical packet that describes the employees that are conducting the work at their facilities, any accreditation they have, the equipment that they're using, the sampling protocol. All of that has to be built out in very, very detailed information. It's a hard thing for the labs to do. We're working, as Abby mentioned, we're working with FDA on addition of almonds to an MOU that already exists for pistachios and Brazil nuts to hopefully alleviate some of this pressure that the labs face. But we don't have any great information to share at this point other than the MOU has been drafted. So let's jump into the reconditioning and kind of what that looks like. So this is a new template that I've been working on. If anybody would like a copy of this, please send me an email, tbirmingham@almondboard.com, and I'll send this to you. It's just a Word document at this point. We're going to make this into an interactive document that the boxes will expand as you type more information into them. But this spells out those areas that I just mentioned to you, in the previous slide. So you have A would be company information, B is information on the product, C is the reconditioning records that are going to be maintained to verify that the reconditioning has happened, and then D is going to be, what is the testing that happens after reconditioning. And so this is something that we're working on right now. The reconditioning guidance document is also going to be updated so that the sections match up with this template here. So on the reconditioning method itself, it's going to be specific to your operation on how you're going to recondition the product. Most companies are going to sort to remove serious damage, insect damage, and thereby lower the levels of aflatoxin. And so you're going to have to describe that process in excruciating detail. It's not enough to just write that I'm going to be utilizing sorting to remove insect damage. That's not enough. You have to describe what type of equipment that's going to be used. If you're using multiple equipment in series or in parallel, you need to describe that. Who's going to be the operators that are on site doing that reconditioning? All of that has to be built out. You have to have flowcharts that describe this. Where you're pulling out those defect samples, you need to describe that in the process as well. What are you doing with those defect samples? All of that has to be described. How are you checking the quality of the product both before and after reconditioning? If you're pulling samples to verify the serious level of the insect damage in that product, so you're doing some grading on that product, some scoring, you need to describe that process, and you need to describe it on the tail end as well after you've pulled out all the insect damage. What are you going to do with all the reject material? That needs to be built out into this plan. It's not enough to say that I'm going to just take this to the dump and destroy it, or I'm going to send it to accepted users. You have to talk about how you're going to segregate this product. You're going to wait for FDA to review what you've done, and then ultimately you're going to take this to the dump and you're going to destroy it. This product under FDA goods return, the rejects that you pull out, they cannot be used under the accepted user program. They will not allow you to take high reject material that can go into animal feed. That will create some challenges with FDA, and they'll reject your plan after reconditioning if you do that. So keep that in mind. You can't treat this like you might your normal reject material that you might use for an edible obligation. This can't be used for that. For your hand and electronic sorting, again, describe how you're going to monitor what's actually happening in the process. It's important to document the weight of material that you're pulling out. All of this detail, it's really needed, and FDA, if you don't have it, is going to reject your plan when you submit it. And then the post-reconditioning compliance verification. So this is where you do need to work with a lab that's done this before. And so make sure when you're talking to your lab about bringing product back for goods return, how you're going to be reconditioning it, make sure they understand that this is under FDA detention. And if they're familiar with the process, they'll tell you they're familiar with the process. But they're going to have to do a lot of work on their end to prepare the packet that will have to be submitted. And then you'll have to describe that you're utilizing a lab that's familiar with FDA goods return that is going to be submitting that data analytic packet. And don't be surprised, their cost is most likely going to be higher than what they would normally charge you for just a normal aflatoxin test under the pre-export check program. There's a lot of work that laboratories have to do to put together this packet. And their turnaround time is probably not going to be what you're normally used to for a pre-export check test. There's a lot more work that these labs have to do. And then as far as sampling, you can reference that you're going to utilize a sampling protocol that mimics what's done under the pre-export check program. So you're pulling incremental samples from throughout the lot. You're coming up with a large 20 kilogram aggregate sample that you're then going to use for analysis. That can be referenced. I mentioned, so use a laboratory familiar with the process. I think most of the PEC labs are familiar with it, but again, if they have management turnover, you just want to verify that they are indeed familiar with goods return and providing the data analytic packet that's required for goods return product. All right, so after you prepare your plan and submit it, you're going to have to wait for FDA to come back to you, and then ultimately, you hope they're going to come back and say that they accept the plan. Normally, the first time we're contacted or I'm contacted is after they've submitted that first plan and FDA has come back and said, we don't accept the plan. And that's normally when a handler will contact me and say, what do we do? I would advise you, if you haven't done this before, contact us before you submit that first plan. We're more than happy to walk through it with you. I'll review the plan with you. If I see that there's any holes in that plan, I'll advise that you should probably make some changes, and I'll tell you exactly what those are. Try not to contact us though after you've submitted that first plan, because you're only going to get one more chance, and if you don't get it right, that's when FDA is going to say your only option is to re-export that product or destroy it. They won't allow you to bring it into the U.S. at that point. So luckily or hopefully, they will accept it. Hopefully it'll be after the first submission so that you don't have to go back and submit additional information. And then you'll be allowed to carry out the reconditioning. And they'll notify you on this FDA Form 766. There'll be a little box that they'll check that says approved. They may have some additional conditions that they put in, or they may send you an email and specify exactly what those are. The important thing is there's going to be a time limit on when you can apply the reconditioning, and so you have to get moving pretty quickly. And then I cannot stress enough, recondition the product exactly as you described you would in your reconditioning plan. Don't take out a processing step. If you say you're going to hand sort, hand sort. If you didn't say you're going to hand sort, don't add hand sorting into it. Apply reconditioning exactly as you said you're going to do in your plan. And then this other point, do not destroy don't do anything with the rejects at this point. After you do your reconditioning, you're going to send this form back to FDA telling them that you've done your reconditioning. You're going to provide any of the documentation that you said you would in your reconditioning plan. You're going to tell them how the product's segregated, both the good product that's been sorted as well as the rejects. And then you're going to tell them, upon approval, we're going to destroy these rejects. We're going to take them to the dump and dispose of them. We're not going to use them under the inedible program. And then hopefully, you've submitted your lab, your sample for lab analysis. The lab analysis comes back, everything's good, and all that information can go on to FDA. So I know that's a lot. Again, we're working on that revised template that I think is going to help kind of streamline and guide handlers along in the process. We're also updating that guidance document. It's about a 4.5-5-page document at this point. And then that form is going to be an interactive form here in the next probably 6 weeks. We'll have that finalized. But I'm happy to share the Word version of that with you all at this point if anybody wants that. Looking at goods return, what's next? We're still working with FDA on an MOU, and I am happy to say that the MOU has been drafted, and now it's being reviewed between USDA and FDA. We know elements of the MOU. We helped to draft what's in there. Our goal is to be able to leverage the systems that we already have in place, maybe take some of the burden off the laboratory since they're already accredited through USDA. Maybe take advantage of the inspectors that are already there on site, doing some of the other work for you on incoming inspection and outgoing inspection so that FDA doesn't have to oversee much of this process. We're just waiting at this point to see the final version of the MOU. There was a meeting with FDA and USDA 2 weeks ago. I've asked for an update and I haven't received one yet, so I'm hoping to hear back soon from USDA on the outcome of that. And then, as I mentioned, we're working on updating our guidance documents. Happy to share those with anyone at this point, and then the final versions will be available in about 6 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you so much.